All right, we are back. Again, if anybody wants to ask a question, type it in the chat. So far, I did not receive any questions, but let me know if you have any questions at all. In the previous lecture, the past hour, I talked about the principles of economic wealth creation. And these principles, how they work, and an outline of a theory in some sense. And we have seen that institutions are very important in that story, and that the mechanisms of trade and how we do business and what those are critical. I want to apply those to understanding what happened in 2008. So in 2007 and in 2008, there was a major crisis in the financial sector of the global economy, starting in the United States and spreading across the world. And this became so bad that financial institutions, in particular banks, did not trust each other anymore. And that loans among banks, interbank loans, completely ceased. So the market, as it was called, froze completely and utterly. That's how bad the trust crisis was. We've seen that in the past more. In the 19th century, it happened several times. And then for a while, it did not happen. Also, the crisis of 1929 was totally different in nature, because that started in the stock market. It was a stock market crisis that spread to the financial sector and to the economy. What happened in 2008 was a banking crisis. It was a institutional crisis. And as such, is a very different kind of story. And it is a very different kind of explanation is required, in my opinion. And so what we see is a classical Great Panic. It compares to the Great Panic of 1873. 1873 was a crisis that started in Vienna, and it's also spread to the then global economy, the Victorian global economy, in a very similar way as 2008. And it was called a Great Panic because that is exactly what it is. A panic is a crisis of trust, and that's exactly what it is. It is a total crisis of trust. And what I want to do in this lecture is talk about what caused this trust crisis. What is at the foundation of this trust crisis? And we have to go back to the social division of labor and how the social division of labor develops. How do we grow economic wealth? How when we are in a certain state of the economy, we have a certain social division of labor, how do we enhance wealth creation? How do we get more wealth? In other words, how do we get growth? And in the social division of labor, there are three different mechanisms that are at the foundation for that. The first one is to enhance capacity. In other words, get more supply chains, get more people working in the social division of labor. Very basic. And there, this very basic growth corresponds to population growth in some sense. But since you have more people, you can refine the social division of labor, even with the same roles and the same goods, to create even more wealth than only population growth. So that is possible. In the lecture notes accompanying this module, I did that. I give you an example of a computational example in which I did this population growth, and we see that there's a tiny uptake possible by simply creating more supply chains of certain goods rather than other goods. Yeah. The second one is very familiar to economists, is technological development. Technological development refers to doing things better, being more productive individually, increasing the productive abilities of individuals. Yeah. And then the final one is the quintessential possibility with supply chains and social division of labor, and that is the deepening of the social division of labor. And that is an institutional innovation, creating more goods, creating more roles of producers of those new goods, and to replace structures with other structures, lengthening the supply chains by creating these new goods and these new roles, making certain roles obsolete. This is a very common development in economic history. This is the thing that happens at critical stages of economic development in the global economy. And this is what I want to talk about, because the deepening of the social division of labor is at the foundation for the crisis of 2008. And I will talk about that in some detail of how that happened. Yeah. So what is the common thing with regard to this deepening? And that is that you get longer chains in these networks. You get more trade relationships, you get more specializations, you get more entities linked with each other in the production network, in that trade network. Yeah. This requires tremendous levels of trust because things are getting more spread out. There are longer chains. How do I trust that things happen? Do I really know that things are okay in China and that they can deliver my intermediary input? Do I really know that? Can I trust that? And so this requires very high levels of trust. And that means you have a well-structured system, you have a well-functioning system, and you have good institutions. And you have flexibility. That's the other thing. You need some form of freedom to respond to what happens. And we've become very good at that in the last 50 years because we built tremendously long supply chains, also physically very long. And travel distances are tremendous that commodities now undertake. They're produced in China, they are shipped all the way across the world to Europe and the United States. And then they're put on a lorry and they travel on the roads for a long, long time before they finally end up in our hands. So these things require tremendous levels of organization, tremendous levels of trust, and flexibility, tremendous flexibility. So institutions are important. Institutions are critical, and the functioning of those institutions. Have you seen this simple example of a tribe with different institutional environments, different institutional designs, how that functions? Very different outcomes are possible. Things that result are very different and very unexpected in some sense. Yeah. All right. So what is at the foundation of the Great Panic of 2008? It is essentially the deepening of the mortgage supply chain in the global economy. Yeah. And what we have is a major trust crisis in the financial sector of the global economy. That is at the foundation of this crisis. And it all starts in the United States in the mortgage market. What is called the mortgage market, of course, is not a mortgage market. It is a mortgage supply chain, and it is based on the social division of labor. That is where innovation happened. That is where a deepening happened, a major deepening. And that is where tremendous complexity was created to make this deepening a reality, and this deepening delivering more wealth. So let's go back in history and see how things were functioning in the United States in that particular sector of the economy, the mortgage sector, so to say. Right? Before the 1980s, the mortgage provision network, as we can call that, was a very simple affair. Savings of clients of banks were used to finance mortgages to people that wanted to buy houses. And a high level of trust, personal trust, was required. You had to go to a bank, you had to shake hands, and you had to sit down with the bank director. You had to show your papers and all your income streams and all that stuff. And then you could maybe get a mortgage for a property. And then you have to put up a lot of money as well. And he would be using saving deposits for that. So it was for the bank also a highly critical, trusting operation. If you could not pay your mortgage, there was trouble. There was a big problem. Yeah, that was all changed in the 1980s and 1990s. A lot of institutions changed in the United States economy. A lot of laws were passed in the 1980s and 90s. Neoliberal policies were enacted, and the liberalization of the financial sector in particular in the United States was a consequence of that. And as a consequence, they were able to completely restructure the mortgage provision network and get away from this highly personal, trusted institutional form to a much more profitable and deeper form, something that led to much higher profits for the banks in particular. Yeah. This required tremendous work on part of the banks to design a system with all kinds of institutional innovations that accompanied this. They needed to invent a lot of things, new products, new rules. And the fundamental redesign was based to not link people that want a mortgage with savers putting their money in a savings account in a bank and using that as equity for issuing mortgages. No, it would mean to link the mortgages to the capital markets, to institutional investors. Institutional investors would buy a product that financed indirectly mortgages that were going to people that wanted to buy a house. And that required new products, new financial products in particular that were sold on the capital market, that involved a new way of allocating mortgages to people that knocked on the door to get a mortgage for a property. And that required a completely new way of attracting clients to the bank for mortgages. And this required completely new design of the institutions of the economy, of the mortgage provision network in particular. Now, this resulted in a property boom because many more people could suddenly get a mortgage. They did not need this enormous elaborate process of showing that they could be trusted. It was much easier to get a mortgage, And that resulted in an increase of demand in the property market. And that resulted in a steady increase of property prices. And that resulted in a higher level of trust that all these mortgages were okay. Because if you have ever increasing housing prices, when you go have somebody not paying their mortgage, you can sell that house and you still get a very good return on the house, and that gives you then no problem. You're covered. Yeah. Now, the banks were like spiders in their web in this redesign. They were not anymore subject to delivering the mortgage or to guarantee the mortgage. They were just a middleman, as we call that. And they turned this whole system into a completely controlled environment for making profits. A Ponzi scheme, essentially, because they did lose all restraints on issuing mortgages to people that knocked on the door. So you got people that got mortgages that were not, you could predict that they would not be able to to pay back these mortgages. Right? They would at some point go bankrupt. But that was no problem because there were ever increasing property prices. So it was all covered by the value of these houses, essentially, that backed up these mortgages. Until it went wrong. Yeah. And it went wrong in 2007. There was a slump in the housing prices in the United States. And suddenly the weaknesses in the institutional design of this mortgage provision network showed up, and the whole thing collapsed. And the collapse was utter, complete. All right, I'm a little bit behind with my text here. So the collapsing property market in 2007 resulted in a collapse of trust in the mortgage provision network. Suddenly, these financial products in the capital market could not be sold anymore. People wanted to get rid of them. There was a total collapse of the prices in the capital market. And suddenly, all equity vanished from all these banks that issued these mortgage-backed securities, as they were called. And suddenly, all these banks were bankrupt in some sense, right? Even though they tried to push off responsibility for guaranteeing mortgages to the property market and to the capital market, they were only partially able to do that. And as a consequence, they were still going bankrupt. All right, I want to do this a little bit more in detail, and I want to therefore describe this whole thing as a network. I will explicitly use a network structure to provide a picture, literally a picture of how all this functioned, right? So let's talk, Mark, about the mortgage supply chain. Let's first talk about the old system that there was before the 1980s. It was all based on the golden rule of banking. Deposits at banks were used as equity to support loans to trustworthy customers, trustworthy customers that wanted the mortgage or wanted the business loan or whatever it was. And that means savings were used to support these mortgages and these loans. So what is the picture that emerged? We have a saver. We have somebody who wants a mortgage. And we get in the middle a bank that mediates between those two. That's really what it comes down to. The bank is an intermediator between the saver and the mortgager. So the saver would put money in a savings account in the bank, And that was used to finance the mortgage on the other side, or to the person that wanted the mortgage. And those relationships were based on trust, because if we could not trust the bank, if they would not pay sufficient interest on the savings account, you would not put your money in a savings account. Those were the days that savings accounts were still bearing decent interest rates, right? We have no need for savings accounts today anymore because we don't care about that anymore. It's not used anymore. On the other hand, the bank had to fully trust the mortgager because, yeah, without trust, there might not be a return. The loan might not be paid off. There would be a huge problem with that, of course. So it was all based on trust, a very deep level of trust, personal trust, institutional trust, in the sense that the bank was trusted, and the bank had this stodgy reputation of a big building on the main street with pillars in front, and you had big doors, and you went through that, and it was all trustworthy, and you had the vault, and you were able to directly talk to the bank director, shake hands with this person, and get things done. In other words, it was a small enterprise. Banks were small in those days, and they acted like small enterprises, and they built very much their networks based on trust. What happened? First of all, what happened was that banks no longer were small. They became bigger and bigger because the United States government changed the laws that allowed merger of banks, even across state boundaries, which was forbidden for a very, very long time. And so, especially in the 90s, we got a tremendous takeoff of bank mergers. And these bank mergers, they resulted in tremendous, huge banks. And these banks wanted huge profitability. They were, they were a huge bank. They were not a mom and pop store anymore. They needed good systems to generate a highly profitable business. Yeah. And that means new products, new roles, and a redesign of your whole operations. And this was again facilitated by the laws that were passed by the United States government in the 1980s and the 1990s. And at the foundation of this was this strong property market in the United States and also in the EU prior to 2007. And this was mainly driven also by the business itself, the business of delivering mortgages to people to buy these homes and expanding, therefore, the property market. Yeah. And all policies were based on that. We got the ownership economy, as it was called. Everybody needed to be an owner of a house, regardless. Right? You would not, you did not have a proper functioning capitalist, modern capitalist society without people having their own homes, owning their own homes. So we got a deepening of the supply chain of the mortgage provision network. And this was based on three related things, and that is products, mortgage-backed securities sold in the capital markets to investors. It was related to socioeconomic roles, specializations, and it was related, of course, to institutions. We got a whole set of new institutions of all kinds of varieties emerging in the 1980s and the 1990s to increase the trustworthiness of this whole operation. So The roles that were introduced was that of a mortgage broker and investment banker. So banks changed their role, and instead of being a retail banker that collected saving deposits in savings accounts, you became an investment banker who operated on capital markets and who brought together as a middleman, brokered in some sense, people that wanted loans and wanted financial products with people that were able to provide the capital, people that operated on those capital markets. The main product that was created here was that of the mortgage-backed security. The mortgage-backed security was created by the banks to be traded on capital market. And what essentially it was that all these mortgages were cut up into tiny little pieces, and they were composed into portfolios. And those portfolios, those mixed portfolios with mixed risks, were then sold on the capital market to institutional investors. So your pension fund would buy, for example, mortgage-backed securities. And the return on those mortgage-backed securities was quite substantial. And it was so-called because it is a portfolio of a set of mortgages of all kinds of varieties, from very risky to extremely low risk. There was a presumption of a high quality product, something that was not that risky. I can put that into a picture. So let's start again with the bank. The bank becomes now an investment bank. That's the main new institutional feature. The bank would interact with institutional investors mainly in the capital market. And it would take that provided capital to the other side and to issue mortgages to people that wanted to buy a house. Yeah. However, it did it a little bit more complex than that. There was an additional layer introduced. A new socioeconomic role was created, that of a broker. The broker was usually attached to a bank branch, but it could also be a broker in an independent office, somewhere in a mall or somewhere on the main street. I'm talking about the United States here, so malls and main streets where the main outlets were, where also the bank branches were. And so the broker was interacting with one side of this chain, and the bank was interacting with the other side of the chain. Broker and the bank were very closely related, even though officially brokers could be independent. They could be independent brokers. They would still be very much dependent on the bank, very much interacting with the bank. So there were two markets that this chain was intermediating between: the capital market on the one hand with the institutional investors, and the mortgage market, where you went, where you advertised also as a broker. You advertised and you got more and more clients, and you tapped into that possibility to attract lots of people that never got a mortgage to get a mortgage this time. And you might still maybe remember maybe that under George W. Bush, George W. Bush talked about the ownership society. Everybody should have a home. Everybody should own a home. And this was a human right. And this was something that should be pursued as a society. And that led to these laws also to be changed to allow this to happen. So we see that the social division of labor totally changed. It really became a different principle of how a mortgage was delivered, how it was created, how it was produced. it went away from this classical banking model. The golden rule of banking was completely abandoned, and instead it became a role of a mechanism of intermediation, something much easier. Yeah, this resulted in very significant economic wealth creation. Profits were tremendous. Economically speaking, the banks became extremely profitable. They were intermediaries, they were middlemen, and middlemen could levy tremendous fees on everything. You levied a fee here on this and a fee on that. You levied a fee on the person who wanted to buy a mortgage. You levied a fee on the person who wanted to buy mortgage-backed securities. And you got tremendously wealthy, and you get tremendous profits out of that role. And we see the profits shooting up through the roof in this world. Yeah. And the risks are much lower, right? And so we can call them middlemen. And the middlemen are very important in understanding the functionality of our networked economy and the social division of labor, right? So if you can create for yourself a middleman position in a supply chain, you are building for success. It means also that there are a lot of people that are losing out, right? Because a lot of people have to pay the price to you as a middleman, and they will be much less well off. And so you got the Ponzi scheme, as I called that. Yeah. So all the gains from the network, in principle, could be siphoned off by these middlemen. And we will see theoretical examples later on in our module, in which I make computations exactly of that nature. You can siphon off, as if you were a monopoly, so to say, tremendous benefits. But these are not monopolies. These are local monopolies in the context of certain supply chains, of certain networks. They have power. They are not monopolies in the old sense, not monopolies like Henry Ford's day, or when Rockefeller had his Standard Oil company dominating 100% of the oil market. Those type of monopolies, market-based monopolies, are quite different in nature. Okay? I want to emphasize that here. Now, even with these innovations, it was not functioning that well. You needed tremendous institutional support. Institutional investors were not that dumb. Why would they buy mortgage-backed securities in which a very large component was based on very shady mortgages? Mortgages provided to people that likely would not be able to pay back the mortgage sum. You had very low income families that got mortgages, and there was no guarantee that these people could pay back their mortgage. Those were high risk mortgages. So how could you sell products, these mortgage-backed securities, with these elements in there to these investors? Well, you needed to persuade them. You needed to push them. And that's exactly what you do. And you design very innovative economic institutions to make that happen. And these were completely controlled by the banks. These new institutions were there to really make this supply chain a success, and to be able to increase the trust in this supply chain. And they went quite far in their creation of new institutions. The first institution that I want to point out is that of the rating agency. Prior to the 1980s, there were some rating agencies, but they were mainly for products that were sold on the capital market. and not for consumer loans or car loans or mortgages even. Now, rating agencies were also introduced for those consumer, for that consumer business. So we get our now familiar rating agencies giving us a credit rating, as it is called, in which they take account of nearly everything that you do. And these credit ratings became extremely important because, of course, people had to be assessed whether they would be able to engage with these complex supply chains, whether they would be profitable or not. Then on the other side, on the capital market side, they introduced insurance. Insurance through hedging of financial risks. And these hedging products were sold by one particular insurance agency, a humongous transnational insurance company called AIG. This humongous company was one of the failures in 2008. It went completely down in flames, leading to accumulation of debt everywhere around. So they sold the mortgage-backed securities together with insurance. These are called collateral debt obligations. So those were created to hedge the risks that were attached to the mortgage-backed securities. Even with all these innovations, banks still had to impose on their institutional investors that they had to buy these things, whether they liked it or not. If they wanted to have services from the bank, they would impose that they, first of all, bought a certain portfolio of these mortgage-backed securities from them. They were really pushers, right? If you compare the supply chain to the supply chain of cocaine, it would be a great comparison. It would be a fitting comparison. Now, in the background, there's the United States government, and even they played their game. It was made their philosophy that everybody should have a house. So you better get your act together and do that, right? The United States government introduced several institutions in the 1960s and also in the 1930s already to guarantee mortgages. So in the 1960s, there was a depression in the housing market. And they figured out that if you give a government guarantee to mortgages, things would be picking up again. So two institutions were introduced, the FRDMC and the FNMA. They would do things slightly different. But anyway, they got to be known as Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, they together guaranteed the mortgages on the mortgage market, on the housing market. So that was step number one. That was on the consumer side, so to say. And on the capital side, there was the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC. They started to cover the trade in mortgage-backed securities. And they underwrote this idea of collateral debt obligation, and everything was fine. The SEC was on board, everything was regulated, everything was declared completely in order. Everything was fine. So here we are. Let's embed the mortgage provision network that we have here, this chain, with some institutions. So first of all, let's have bank support. This is private provision of institutions in some sense. And those are the rating agencies. They would be closely related to the banks. They would be controlled by the banks, and they are operating on both sides of this network, on the side of the consumer market for mortgages and on the side of the capital market, the mortgage-backed security market. And then AIG would be offering a product to all these investors. They would be selling insurance, essentially, collateral debt obligations to these institutional investors. And they would reap, of course, wonderful profits from that as well. Let's move on then to the second type of support, institutional support, that is government-induced support. We have Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae operating on the consumer side, and we have the SEC operating on the capital side. Yeah. So this is our framework. I feel I'm a bit over time now. I think we need a short break. So I will take a 3-minute break. So 16:40 we will resume. I see we have a question by Ibrahim about these products. What is the value of these products? How do we determine that? Well, we will see later on when we go back, we go to this theory of determination of value. We see that essentially these things have no value. That's the whole point, the whole problem. It's at the core of the problem. It has no value. And so when it is all based on trust, and when that trust goes away, it just collapses. The price becomes zero very easily and very quickly. And that's exactly what happened in 2008, of course, right? So the system collapsed. All these products became suddenly worthless. But the houses have still tremendous value, right? This is, at the foundation are these houses. And people want houses, and they have use value. People are willing to pay prices. The housing price never went to zero. But the mortgage-backed security, that price went to zero. It's an intermediary product. intermediary products have indirect use value only. And sometimes that indirect use value is high or very, very low. And that's the problem. The problem is that it is all a fiction. And fictions have no value in some sense. They're just stories. Yeah. Did I answer your question, or we're way off with this? Because you're also talking about, can you create, when you create more instruments like this, do you create more wealth? Not necessarily, because the wealth is the use value of these houses. That's why the wealth is. That's what we produce. That's what we use. These intermediary products to finance that, they are just tools. They are requirements to do it. Yeah. I hope I answered your question. It will probably become more clear when we go on in our module and we go to these mathematical models of these network economies. Yeah. All right. So prior to 2007, this was a relatively low risk business. The cocaine was flowing strongly, so to say. No problems. High resale value of houses on which this was all based. And profitability was tremendous. Now, in 2007, this changed. And suddenly, all the guarantees that were promised had to be kicked in. So Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, they were guaranteeing these mortgages. Suddenly, whenever there was a failure, since the housing market was in a slump and the prices were lower than expected, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae had to step in and to indeed cough up the guarantee for those mortgages, which it was not made to do in some sense. And they went essentially bankrupt as well. Yeah. So, meanwhile, mortgage-backed securities were rated very high by these rating agencies. Very, very, very high. As if there was no risk attached to it at all. And that was based on these computational models that are so popular in finance, which are based on hypotheses that do not really make sense when you think about it from this perspective. Yeah. And it was related also to the fact that, you know, this was pushed essentially by the banks very much. Yeah. And credit default swaps and collateral debt obligations, all these things were pushed as well. And those were issued by AIG. Okay. Now, in 2007, that all changed. Risks are not independent. Risks, when things go wrong, it is like a domino. Everything collapses in order, in sequence. There is no IID in the real world. And this crisis showed that. If there was one lesson to be learned, is that financial risks should be treated in a very different way than we usually do with portfolio theory, right? The financial risk is as high as the weakest link in the chain of products, essentially, in this domino chain. Anyway, the trust completely collapsed between banks and investors, and a little bit after that between banks themselves. Suddenly all the equity flowed away. All the equity was declared zero. It was worthless. And suddenly there was no equity to back up any loan, anything anymore, right? A total collapse of the system. And this was an institutional failure. And all the institutions that you have and would normally kick in to prevent this collapse were not strong enough. They were deemed insufficient. And the economy just, the institutions just collapsed. Okay, so note also that this system was designed for the profitability of the banks by the banks. The banks lobbied government for certain laws. The banks designed the institutional environment for this network. And it was all about the profits for the bank. It was not about guaranteeing the network or to make it function well. That was certainly not the case. Rating agencies and AIG also were all controlled by the banks. And we know the names of these agencies. They're still around. Equifax and Experian for consumer ratings, your credit ratings. And Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch were investment rating agencies. Yeah. And then for insurance instruments, we had AIG, of course. AIG failed, but those rating agencies are still around. And they still play their role today even. They played a major role in 2010 and 2011 during the Euro crisis, which I will talk about next. Yeah. Anyway, things just failed. Neoliberal policies under Clinton and Bush really took away power from the government agencies to do anything at all in the capital markets, in controlling these banks. It was simply not done. It was not part of the philosophy. It was not part of the ideology. We live in a market society and the market regulates itself and everything is wonderful because things will be normal. Yeah? So ultimately, this is a trust crisis. Trust is a form of embeddedness. It is trusting the institutions, trusting the products that you trade, trusting the mechanisms, trusting the way that it is financed, trusting all these things, trusting our fictional narratives. That is trust. Trust is institutional trust. That failed. That failed completely. And as a consequence, nobody could trust banks anymore. Nobody could trust the products that they created. All of that went away. And suddenly, all these products were priced at zero. Nobody wanted to trade them anymore. No. So institutional trust, as we can call that, is at the foundation of a well-functioning economy, always. And if that institutional trust is lost, the social division of labor will collapse. It will hamper. And that is what we see again and again and again. We build up the social division of labor, we deepen it, create more wealth. And at some point, something breaks, something goes wrong. There always goes something wrong. And there's a collapse, a total collapse sometimes. And 2008 is a great example of a total collapse. It was an institutional trust crisis, as I would like to call that then. How did governments respond after 2008? What happened? First of all, there was tremendous injection of a government-issued capital into the markets and the financial corporations. TNC stands for Transnational Corporation. All the major banks were flooded with means with equity in some sense. Um, the name for that was quantitative easing. It is essentially that you print money, but in a very strange way, in a very neoliberal way. Namely, you issue it as electronic money into the banks directly and through a central bank, of course. Very different from what happened under traditional capitalism, where you literally put on the printer and you print notes and you distribute that somehow in the economy to the people. This is the type of financial collapse that you had in the 1920s in Germany. You had the hyperinflation there. That was based on that the government was printing money and more money and more money to finance the debt that was created by the First World War. And Germany had to pay tremendous debts to the winners, the allies in World War I, to France and to the United Kingdom and to the United States. And of course, they could not pay that. They did not have enough gold or things like that. And so they started to issue banknotes to pay all these debts. And it came back totally as a total collapse of the economy. This was different. Here you get a certain influx of capital into a very specific sector in the economy, namely the financial sector. And they blew it up like a balloon, which is always happening, of course. But the real sector of the economy, the economy of the physical goods, the manufacturing economy, was not affected that much by this. And so you got tremendous growth of the capital markets, the stock markets, but not, you had no inflation in the manufacturing economy. The price of bread was not affected by this. This is in comparison to the 1920s hyperinflation, where the money that was pumped in the economy directly affected the manufacturing sector, essentially. This was also deemed socialism for banks, by the way, as a remark. And TNCs were jumping up in profits again. I mean, everything was wonderful after a very short amount of time. Here we see a little graph depicting that. Here you see US banks, the profitability of US banks. Yeah, you see here that things collapsed in 2007. And by 2012, everything was normal again, right? So it was a very short affair for these banks. And very few banks went actually bankrupt. It was not like the 1930s, where the big crisis of 1929 resulted in a tremendous number of bankruptcies. Yeah, so it is a really different event from 1930s. This 2008. Here we see general US corporate profit margin per unit of production, the long run, from the 1940s all the way to 2013. And you see here this tremendous dip appearing at the end in the early 21st century, and then again in 2009. You see that the dip in the early 21st century is much deeper than the dip from the crisis of 2008. The dip in the early 2000s is the dot-com crisis, as it is called. Nevertheless, even though it doesn't show up in these figures of profitability, the crisis of 2009 was much, much more severe. And we are living in the ruins, as I said, of this crisis. The economy never really recovered that well. after that, because it was spreading out after that. After the government response to save these corporations, um, there was a transfer of all these debts to government, essentially. Government, through this quantitative easing, through this direct investment into the banks, they transferred these bad debts to the financial sector, from the financial sector onto the books of the government. And so they had to deal with that. How do you deal with that? In Ireland, Irish Republic, they created this very special bank, NAMA, to take care of that. That is where they collected their bad debts, so to say. And very slowly, they got rid of those debts. And it was a kind of bankruptcy process. So the crisis triggered this deep recession for a couple of years. It was called the Great Recession by many people. But after 2011, it continued. It was not that it abated. There was also the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone. It was a direct consequence of 2008. Namely, in the Eurozone, because of its institutional design, again, institutions, the institutional design of the Eurozone is flawed. And as a consequence, this transfer of debts from the banks onto the governments in the Eurozone was not able to resolve itself that well, because the euro was set up in a very strange way. It is not functioning as a normal currency. Normal currency, you have a fluctuation of the exchange rate, of course, with other currencies. That is more or less a policy instrument by a central bank. That was not allowed. The central bank could not do operations to really manipulate that. There was no ability to issue, to balance the economy from surpluses in one zone of the Eurozone, or one area of the Eurozone, to another area of the Eurozone, right? So you could not transfer the surplus that was created in the German economy to the Greek economy in an easy way through central bank operations. And this, of course, is possible in the United States, where the Federal Reserve System is set up to do exactly that. Anyway, there resulted therefore unbalanced debts. We got Greece, it was a complete failed economy in 2010. It totally collapsed under the weight of the debt that was transferred to their government from those banks that they had. The Irish Republic was a total collapse as well. These banks, all the Irish banks went totally bankrupt, except they were not allowed to go bankrupt. And somehow they had to be saved. And so the government of the Irish Republic took on all these debts, all of them. And somehow by extreme austerity measures, got rid of those. They had the bankruptcy process for the whole country in some sense. They declared the country bankrupt in some sense, not by act of announcement, now we are bankrupt, but by going through the process of bankruptcy, getting rid of the debts. A very painful process, a very, very painful process with increasing taxation, with extreme austerity. Not good at all. So it morphed into a budgetary deficit crisis for governments, this debt crisis, the sovereign debt crisis. And it led to austerity, right? The EU, since that crisis, the EU is an institution of austerity in some sense. Yeah. And austerity resulted into collapse of commodity prices in 2015. So the effects of this crisis in 2008 are are really like waves over time. They are major waves that affect the functionality of the global economy. And even the emerging economies, the BRICS economies, as we call that, Brazil, Russia, China, India is also in that list, South Africa. Those emerging economies took a big hit as well. Suddenly they were not that much emerging anymore. China was the least affected, but Russia was very badly affected and never really recovered. It's a struggling economy to today. Brazil is not as glorious anymore as in the days of the BRICS, so to say. Now, what is an explanation for this? Is there a general feature to our network design that features here that failed, that led to this enormous crisis? And if there's one culprit, it's the platform design of the supply chains that make up our production network in our global economy. And these platforms are inhabited by transnational corporations. They have no home. Apple, Google, to name a few, but also um, um, more traditional corporations like the Unilever and other major manufacturing corporations, Boeing, Airbus, they are transnational. They have no home anymore. They have some head office somewhere. They play games with governments to avoid paying taxes. Yeah. And all of them have in common that they are organizing themselves as platforms to organize and control their supply chain. So they control part of this global network, this incarnation of the social division of labor. They are in control of that. They determine what is going on there. They design the institutions that uh, under that underpin the functionality of these parts of the economy, right? So Apple is a great example. Apple is the ultimate platform corporation. Apple sets its own rules. It sets its own tax rates, right? You can't call it tax rate, but if you want to sell your products um, on the store, the Apple App Store, you're taxed tremendously. Google does the same, Facebook, all of them function in exactly the same way. They take tremendous profit margins on all kinds of products. Apple does not produce anything itself. It is all outsourced. It is acting like a little spider in an enormous web. They control everything, uh, but they direct where people have to go, where corporations have to go, right? So Foxconn, for example, is a tremendously huge manufacturing corporation in Taiwan that produces Apple computers. They are an independent corporation. They have a contract with Apple. And every year or every once in a while, there is a negotiation, a completely secret negotiation between Foxconn and Apple that sets the price of what Foxconn is paid for the products that they produce. And they are controlling their further supply chain again. So Apple is completely in control of all of these negotiations and who produces what in the supply chain. This is the modern way of doing business. Be a platform, be a middleman, because that is what it is. So this is the main institutional feature of our contemporary global economy. This is what defines our neoliberal global economy. And it is totally different from the classical capitalist economy that was studied by people like Marx, by Keynes, And it requires a new way of thinking. It requires us to be able to really develop new ideas to how to understand all of this. It is a form of outsourcing. Everything is outsourced to the extreme. And the worst part of it is that governments have also organized themselves now as platforms. It is this platform ideology is widespread, and all institutions or all entities in our economy want to organize as platforms, want to be these middlemen, and governments are not different. And so governments outsource everything. So we get the gig economy, the entrepreneurial self as models of work and economic participation. We organize our economy completely around these platforms. And platform economy is something that you can call post-capitalism. It's a form of capitalism that is not true to what capitalism used to be from the 18th century through the 20th century. Our 21st century economy is fundamentally different from capitalism that was incarnated in the economies before the 21st century. And that is what I want to emphasize here. We are looking at very different economies. Yeah. And the starting point for all of this is 1971, when the Bretton Woods system collapsed. That can be seen as a starting point for all of this, and we can call that the neoliberal revolution. And 2008 is in some sense a collapse of that initial state of this neoliberal economy, the platform economy. It is the exuberance of this new form of organization that collapsed in 2008. And we have not yet found how to organize our economy in which we treat these platforms in a mature way, in a way that we can control them, that they don't get out of control, that they don't collapse in some sense. And that is why I call it the ruins of 2008. A few remarks about how the economy looks like. I'm going quite well over time now. It's already 5, but just let me finish this. Just a few more slides. What are the features of this economy? Very long, thin supply chains with many, many entities. Extreme wealth generation, leading to very significant inequality. And I will make models for that. The cause is that intermediary products are fundamentally different from consumer products. Direct use value is different from indirect use value. Intermediary products, like we saw those mortgage-backed securities, they have no foundation for wealth. They have no foundation for value. Their price can become zero. And then there's the incompetency in this type of economy. Platforms don't do their own job anymore. They have no expertise. I talked about increasing potential specialization because you become a specialist in something. Well, the ultimate platform is a specialist in nothing. And we see that with governments today. Governments are incompetent. They fail to deal with problems. They fail to deal with the COVID crisis. They fail to deal with the issues that are currently plaguing our economy. They were never able to really deal with 2008. They got rid of it by making everybody miserable. And that's exactly what is showing. People have had enough of the misery and they're rioting in the streets. Literally today, the riots in all kinds of in all kinds of countries all over the world, against governments mainly. It is the incompetency of governments that is causing this. I argue that platforms, since they are just tools to manipulate, tools to control, lead to lower productivity, and they are reducing wealth creation. Since the 1980s, there has been a tremendous decline in the wealth that is generated in the manufacturing economy. GDP has going up and up and up, but GDP for a large part is the financial sector and the service sector. And these are intermediary goods in all regards. So it is the wealth that we attribute to intermediary goods, which is completely artificial, that give us our growth. And the real stuff, the use value stuff, houses, cars, food, healthcare itself, productivity related to that is actually declining. This is the great productivity puzzle that we are facing today. And there is a negative growth in the manufacturing sector of the economy. It is declining. It is not going well with that manufacturing sector at all. And there are real issues with that. And it is obscured, this totally covered up by these activities that happen in the service economy, the financial sector of the economy, for example. Yeah. And one of the causes of this reduction of wealth are that platforms are highly unproductive and have no competence. And that shows up in those figures in some sense. All right, this concludes the second lecture. Next week, I will do 2 lectures again, and that covers then the basics of the theory of economic wealth creation. And I hope I will not go over time like I did today. It was way too long today. So let's hope I can keep it well within 3 hours. So I apologize for taking so much of your time today. Let me know if you have any questions, send me emails. The chat will remain open for a little bit. Let me know whether you have any questions with regard to this. I will try to share the recordings of this. I hope it's recorded. And I will try to share the recordings with you as you can see back some parts of these presentations. All right, thank you, and until next week then. Bye.